Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Datejust 36 versus the Datejust 41. So as with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of the Datejust. We're going to go back to the 1940s, specifically 1945, which marked the 40th anniversary for Rolex. And to celebrate this, they wanted to release an anniversary watch, and that watch was the reference 4467. The 4467 was a really special watch in the fact that it featured a world's first in terms of watchmaking. Rolex had invented a movement that was basically the first ever automatic movement to feature a date function that also switched over automatically at midnight. So it was really important, an important progression in watchmaking at the time. It wasn't officially known as the Datejust though until the 50s. That's when it gained its name, Datejust, and also in the late 50s we saw the reference or the reference series 1600, which is kind of the exact same look that we have even now for the Datejust. Skipping a few years on to the 70s, we saw an update to the movement that allowed the user to be able to adjust the date independently of all the other features on the dial. So hours and minutes, you could actually, instead of having to cycle through the hours and minutes of the day to adjust your date like you had to do on previous iterations of the Datejust, this 70s edition allowed you to just adjust the date on its own. Over the years, various different metals, combinations of metals, precious metals, etc., different special dials and bracelets and movements, etc. were released over the years, but the one we're looking at or interested in now is actually released in 2009. But just to go back in time again, the largest or kind of the standard men's size for the Datejust was the 36mm. There were ladies' variations of the Datejust that were smaller, but really the most popular model for men was the 36. That was in fact the men's size, and it didn't come in any larger sizes than the 36mm. Kind of in the mid-2000s, early mid-2000s, the hip-hop scene really brought a lot of attention to expensive watches, and the demand for larger watches was growing massively. That's really what the consumer was after. And so Rolex recognized this and updated the Datejust from that kind of very old classic 36mm size to a 41mm case size in 2009 when they released the Datejust 2. The Datejust 2 was very, very popular. The moment it was released, the kind of 36mm Datejust was far less popular. I mean, it really lost massive popularity and has kind of lost a lot of popularity throughout the years now since the larger ones have come out, which is understandable because 36mm by today's standard is a very, very small men's watch. The Datejust 2 was replaced in 2016, so it had a very limited run, only 7 years. And it was replaced by the Datejust 41, which was a much more refined version of the Datejust 2. It was a bit more of a direct scaled up version of the 36, so it featured much more of the same proportions and dimensions that the 36 did. That concludes the history of these two watches. Let's take a look at the features. Just quickly, just to note, with the features of these two that we're looking at, I've selected slightly different variations of the watches, so I haven't got a direct match of a 36 to a direct match of a 41, so not the same dial, bezel, bracelets. I've chosen slightly different bracelets, slightly different dials, slightly different bezels. That's just so I can show you the other options that are available for the Datejust rather than just a direct comparison. But these both are good models to be able to compare them anyway. So starting with the features, or looking at the features, we're going to start with the clasp. The clasp on these watches are the same. They both feature the oyster clasp that is specific for the Datejust. It's not the sporty variation of the oyster clasp. The sportier variation features a fold-over section on the clasp, which I personally much prefer. The less so sporty models in the Rolex collection will feature this clasp. For example, a Sky Dweller, Datejust, etc., yeah, as I said, I much prefer the fold-over. I think it adds that extra security. Not that this would come off your wrist, but it definitely is easier for this to ping off your wrist than something like the oyster clasp on a Daytona, for example. Moving now onto our bracelets, we've got an oyster bracelet on the 41mm that we're looking at today. The oyster bracelet is just a standard bracelet for Rolex. It's This one features the polished center links and brushed outer links, which is again very, very standard for Rolex models. Most of the models will feature this bracelet. It's a fantastic bracelet, doesn't tend to wear out over time, it's very comfortable. It's just a great looking iconic Rolex bracelet. The other alternative you have for the Datejust series is what we have on the 36mm, and this one is the Jubilee bracelet. The Jubilee is the kind of standard Datejust bracelet. It's the iconic Datejust look and kind of in some way the iconic Rolex look. If you're looking for the most iconic looking Rolex, you either choose a Submariner or you choose a Datejust with a fluted bezel and a Jubilee bracelet. You can't get really more Rolex than that. The Jubilee bracelet is a great looking bracelet. It features many more sort of smaller links versus the Oyster bracelet, so it does conform to wrist sizes much better than the Oyster bracelet and therefore can be a bit more comfortable. Those finer links also do glint and glimmer and create a bit more of an expensive look. Versus the Oyster bracelet, it definitely does look like a higher end, more dressy, expensive watch than something with an Oyster bracelet on it. When it's paired with the fluted bezel as well, which unfortunately this one isn't for this comparison because I wanted to show you a smooth bezel option too. When it's paired with a fluted bezel, it does look absolutely fantastic. Personally, of the two, I much prefer an Oyster bracelet purely because I prefer to be a bit more under the radar. I like the kind of more subtle look that the Oyster bracelet has. Moving now on to the cases for these two watches. The cases, of course, where you'll see the main difference between these two pieces, even though the difference in numbers, 36 to 41 is quite a large jump. The difference in how they wear is not massive, but it is definitely obvious. The Datejust was always designed as a 36mm watch though. So technically the dimensions and the proportions of the 36 are, the much purer and truer Datejust here. So the 36 technically is the correct size and the purer version of the Datejust. But that's what I loved about the 41 as opposed to the Datejust 2, is the 41 feels more like a scaled up version of the 36, and that's why I think it works better. The 41 is really, really popular, however, as it is, like I said before, much more of a modern style case size. You will notice though that Rolex hasn't scaled up that case diameter so much so that the lugs splay so far out from your wrist on the 41mm. If you look at the 41 versus the 36, you'll see that the lugs aren't actually that much longer on the 41 versus the 36. And that's obviously in an effort to make sure that the watch doesn't wear too large or span over the edges of someone's wrist. The bezels on these two watches obviously are slightly different because I just wanted to show you a comparison, but I'll just discuss the fluted bezel first. So obviously on the 41 we're looking at, we've got a fluted bezel, which is iconic Datejust. It's absolutely beautiful, obviously shared by the Day-Date and also the Sky Dweller as well. A really, really beautiful looking bezel on these models. I absolutely love the fluted bezel. The fluted bezel on the 41mm is slightly wider than the 36. It's definitely wider than like a scaled up version as well. So a 36mm fluted bezel looks very fine and thin. I personally much prefer that wider fluted bezel that we see on the Datejust 41. The one that we're looking at on the 36 is the smooth bezel, also available on both models. The smooth bezel is great if you really want to be much more under the radar, a bit more understated. The fluted bezel is definitely very loud and blingy, whereas that smooth is just super subtle, much more of a sporty looking watch. Moving on to the dials on these two watches, there are some subtle differences between the dials. I'm just going to compare direct equivalent dials, so I'll use the black index marker dial for this comparison. We do have many little numbers at the end of the index markers on the 41, which makes it feel a little bit more sporty versus the 36mm. The hands and the index markers on both of them are kind of similar. I mean, obviously they're scaled up on the 41, but they are kind of like a direct scale up. They're not way larger than the 36. They just look kind of exactly the same on the dial as they do, on the 36, which is nice. Due to the smaller dial on the 36 and all that information having to be crammed into a smaller dial, I definitely find it is less legible. If we have a client that struggles with their eyesight, I tend to try and steer them away from that 36 purely because it is a little bit harder to read. There are a couple differences between these models of what you can get in terms of options though. So we'll just quickly run through that. There's only really a couple differences between these two models. The 36mm does offer you a diamond set bezel, factory diamond set bezel, whereas the 41mm only offers you smooth and fluted. So the 36 offers you smooth, fluted and diamond. There are more dials also available on the 36mm as well. Not just because of that diamond bezel combination, but they do have just a wider range of bezels, dials on that watch. I think that's probably because the 36 caters both for men and women, so they have to offer some more women appropriate dials on that 36, whereas the 41 is aimed more at men, even though both men and women wear that watch. But in terms of differences though, that's kind of it. I mean, the rest of the watches, you can get the same options for both. Overall, how do they wear on the wrist? The 36mm kind of feels a bit deeper on your wrist than the 41mm does. I think that's partly because they feature pretty much an identical depth, and the 41 is obviously much larger, so it spreads that depth over a larger area and doesn't feel quite as deep then. Whereas the 36 obviously is very small, same depth, makes it feel larger or deeper, sorry. It is a big difference in size when you wear them on your wrist, but it's not insane. I'd say the 36 would suit a wrist size from kind of 12, 13 centimeters all the way up to possibly 18 centimeters. It would look small on 18 centimeters, but it would still look okay. Depends on the style you're looking for. Whereas the 41mm, I'd say would probably fit a wrist size from about 15 centimeters all the way up to 23 centimeters. It definitely fits a much larger range of wrists, the 41. The 36 is great still though for those clients that just want that more classic look. We still have those clients that just are after that old school style 36 look, which is great that Rolex still offers it. And also with so many different options, and they obviously updated it last year as well, and it looks fantastic in the dials that they updated it with. Saying that, interestingly, within the last year, we've actually had more interest in the 36mm Datejust than the 41mm Datejust, which is really, really strange, because previous to that, or previous to last year, we really had very little interest to no interest in the 36mm. So overall, which of these two do I prefer, the 41 or the 36? I think it's a tough one for me because I usually go for smaller watches. If you've noticed in all the reviews, I tend to prefer a smaller watch to big bulky watches. But in the case of this comparison, I would have to choose the 41. I much prefer the way it wears on my wrist, and actually most of our clients' wrists as well. I think it looks much better and suits such a wide range of wrists. The dimensions, even though the 36 is more pure to the original Datejust, I actually think the dimensions and proportions on the 41 look nicer. Both of them are great watches though. Let us know in the comments which of the two you prefer. And as always, if you're interested in either of these models, then please don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description and also the end of the video. It would be a pleasure to call either of these watches into stock for you.